The aftermath of the ritual did not arrive with celebration or clarity but with a strange, aching quiet that settled over the world like the pause after a held breath, because although the immediate pull of surrender had weakened, the deeper currents beneath reality continued to shift, slow and deliberate, and hope felt them constantly now, like distant tides moving under her skin, reminding her that nothing so vast ever ends cleanly, it only changes shape. In the days that followed, those who had gathered at the cliffside cathedral returned to their lives altered in subtle but profound ways, carrying with them a renewed sense of agency that felt fragile yet fiercely protected, as though each decision they made now mattered more than it ever had before. Hope stayed awake for long hours, not out of fear but out of responsibility, learning to listen to the world the way one listens to a living being, attuning herself to emotional pressure points where despair clustered and where choice grew heavy, because the force that opposed her had not vanished, it had retreated, studying, adapting, waiting for moments of weakness rather than announcing itself with spectacle. Sonia noticed the change in her daughter immediately, the way Hope's gaze lingered on people a second too long, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence as if listening to something no one else could hear, and although Sonia had long since accepted that Hope's life would never be ordinary, the maternal instinct to protect surged stronger than ever, tempered only by the understanding that protection now meant trust rather than control. Fred, too, felt the shift, sensing that his role as a father had evolved into something broader, something rooted not just in guarding his child but in modeling the very courage and accountability that the world so desperately needed, and he threw himself into that purpose with quiet determination, speaking openly about his past mistakes, mentoring others who struggled under the weight of guilt, and reminding them that redemption was not a moment but a practice repeated daily. Meanwhile, reports continued to surface of isolated incidents that hinted at the enemy's new strategy, people experiencing sudden emotional numbness rather than despair, drifting away from relationships and obligations not in pain but in indifference, as if the effort of caring had been gently siphoned away, and Hope recognized this as the next evolution of the threat, because despair could still provoke resistance, but apathy hollowed people out from the inside, leaving nothing solid to push against. She began to understand that the force opposing her was no longer trying to dominate humanity but to dissolve it, to erode the connective tissue of meaning and responsibility until choice itself felt irrelevant, and that realization terrified her more than any ritual or contract ever had, because how do you fight something people willingly accept as relief? In response, Hope adjusted her approach, shifting from crisis intervention to cultivation, focusing not on stopping collapse but on strengthening roots, encouraging communities to rebuild rituals of meaning that had nothing to do with magic or bargains and everything to do with shared responsibility, honest conversations, collective mourning, accountability circles, acts of service performed without recognition, and slowly, painstakingly, these efforts began to form pockets of resistance that did not shine brightly but endured steadily. Yet even as Hope worked tirelessly, cracks began to form within her, hairline fractures in the armor of resolve she wore so well, because the constant awareness of suffering, the endless responsibility of standing between humanity and its own worst impulses, began to blur the boundaries of her identity, and she found herself wondering in rare moments of exhaustion whether she was still allowed to want anything for herself, or whether desire itself was now a luxury she could no longer afford. These thoughts frightened her, because they echoed the very logic of surrender she was fighting against, and in those moments she leaned heavily on Sonia, who reminded her that choosing oneself was not selfish but necessary, that even light needs fuel or it burns out, and Sonia's words carried weight precisely because they were not theoretical, they were forged in lived pain, in years of fear transformed into courage through deliberate choice. As Hope listened, she realized that the enemy's greatest advantage was not power but patience, its willingness to wait for fatigue, for the slow erosion of will, and she understood that her greatest weapon would have to be sustainability rather than sacrifice, continuity rather than martyrdom. This insight reshaped her strategy entirely, leading her to seek others who could share the burden rather than shouldering it alone, individuals not chosen by prophecy or ritual but by demonstrated resilience, people who had faced their own darkness and chosen responsibility anyway, and as this network grew, loosely connected yet united by shared values. Hope felt something shift within herself, a subtle easing of pressure, the realization that balance was never meant to be held by one being alone. Still, the opposing force did not remain idle, and as Hope's influence spread, it began to counter not with temptation but with distortion, twisting narratives to paint responsibility as cruelty and boundaries as oppression, reframing choice as an unfair burden imposed by those strong enough to carry it, and this rhetoric found fertile ground in places already wounded by inequality and exhaustion, creating ideological fractures that threatened to turn communities against one another, and Hope was forced to confront a painful truth, that light can be used as a weapon as easily as darkness, and that her presence alone could not prevent misuse of the principles she stood for. This led to one of her most difficult decisions yet, the choice to step back from visibility, to allow others to lead without her shadow looming over them, even though every instinct urged her to intervene, to correct, to guide, and in relinquishing control she faced her own fear of irrelevance, her own need to be needed, recognizing that even guardians must guard against ego. During this period of withdrawal, she retreated with Sonia to a quiet coastal town where the sea stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and there, stripped of constant crisis, Hope confronted the parts of herself she had neglected, grieving not just the lives lost to the old contracts but the innocence she herself had never truly known, the version of life she would never experience, and in that grief she discovered a deeper compassion not only for humanity's failures but for its exhaustion. Understanding at last why surrender could feel so tempting, and why the enemy's offer was not always malicious but deeply seductive. It was there, during a storm that battered the shoreline and forced mother and daughter indoors, that Hope finally spoke aloud the fear she had been carrying in silence, that one day she might grow tired enough to stop choosing, and Sonia, holding her through the roar of wind and rain, did not dismiss that fear or try to banish it with reassurance, but acknowledged it fully, reminding Hope that vigilance was not about never faltering but about returning to choice even after doubt, again and again, and that the world did not need her to be infallible, it needed her to be honest. Strengthened by this truth, Hope returned to her work with renewed clarity, accepting that failure was not the end but part of the process, and that the enemy's greatest fear was not her power but her perseverance, the quiet refusal to disengage. Meanwhile, subtle changes began to ripple outward as communities strengthened their internal bonds, as people learned to sit with discomfort rather than fleeing it, as choice slowly regained its weight and meaning, and the opposing force, sensing this shift, began to concentrate its efforts, preparing something larger, something that would test not just individuals but collective resolve. Hope felt this gathering storm long before it manifested, a tightening in the fabric of possibility, and she knew that the coming confrontation would not be fought in hidden rituals or quiet dreams but in the open, across societies and belief systems, forcing humanity to confront the question it had long avoided, whether freedom was worth the pain of responsibility. As she stood once more at the threshold between worlds, feeling the pull of countless lives leaning unknowingly toward decision, Hope did not steel herself for battle in the traditional sense, but grounded herself in the simplest truth she had learned through every sacrifice and struggle, that light does not conquer darkness by force but by endurance, by staying present when withdrawal feels easier, and as the world edged closer to its next great reckoning, she chose, once again, to stay. As the next phase unfolded, it did so not with explosions or revelations but with a slow, grinding tension that stretched across months, a pressure that reshaped lives in ways so gradual most people never noticed until they looked back and realized they were no longer who they had been, because the enemy Hope sensed had learned something crucial from watching humanity for so long, that the surest way to win was not to break people, but to tire them, and this weariness crept in everywhere at once, in reminders that never arrived, in apologies that were never offered, in systems that quietly stopped caring whether individuals mattered at all, and Hope felt this exhaustion settle into the collective consciousness like dust, coating everything, dulling sharp edges, softening outrage into resignation, until even the idea of resistance felt strangely outdated. She traveled constantly now, not because she believed movement itself was the answer but because stillness had begun to feel dangerous, because wherever people gathered in large numbers the emotional gravity grew heavier, and in those dense spaces the enemy's influence spread fastest, whispering that no single action mattered, that no individual choice could possibly counter forces so vast. And Hope knew this lie intimately because she had once been the proof of its opposite, a single child whose life had shifted the balance of something ancient, yet convincing others of this truth required more than symbols or stories, it required patience beyond measure. In one city she encountered a group of former activists who had once burned with purpose and now sat quietly in a half-abandoned community center, maintaining old posters on the walls like relics rather than calls to action, and as Hope listened to them speak she heard not bitterness but grief, the grief of people who had tried and failed and could not bear the cost of trying again, and she did not lecture them or attempt to reignite their fire with lofty words, instead she asked them why they had begun in the first place. And as they spoke of specific faces, individual injustices, personal losses, something shifted, because the enemy thrived on abstraction, on turning suffering into an overwhelming mass, while Hope understood that meaning survived in particulars, in names, in stories that could still hurt because they still mattered. Meanwhile, Sonia's work deepened in parallel, her foundation evolving into something quieter but more resilient, a network of spaces where people could confront their own responsibility without shame, and she noticed a pattern emerging among those who resisted the pull of apathy most effectively. They were not the strongest or most privileged, but those who had already lost something irretrievable and chosen not to numb themselves in response, people who understood that pain acknowledged was survivable, while pain denied became corrosive, and this insight became central to their strategy, shaping programs that emphasized emotional literacy, communal accountability, and the radical idea that discomfort was not an enemy but a teacher. Fred, too, found himself called into unexpected roles, his history of public confession making him a reluctant but powerful voice in discussions about truth and consequence, and he spoke not as a reformed villain or a moral authority but as someone who had learned the cost of avoidance firsthand, and his honesty resonated precisely because it was unpolished, because he never claimed redemption was complete or easy, only that it was possible if one stayed present. As this effort expanded, the opposing force grew more aggressive, abandoning subtlety in favor of scale, and entire regions experienced what analysts would later call the drift, a phenomenon in which large populations disengage simultaneously from civic participation, family structures, and long-term planning, not through protest or despair but through an eerie calm acceptance that nothing they did would matter anyway, and governments responded clumsily, oscillating between denial and authoritarian attempts to force engagement, which only accelerated the problem by validating the enemy's narrative that responsibility was a burden imposed from above rather than a shared choice. Hope watched these developments with mounting concern, aware that the conflict was approaching a critical threshold, because once apathy reached a certain density it became self-sustaining, and reversing it would require a shock not of fear but of meaning, something that could cut through numbness without relying on catastrophe, and this realization led her to the most difficult conclusion yet, that the enemy could not be defeated solely by resistance, but by reawakening desire, not desire for comfort or escape, but desire for agency, for participation, for the messy, imperfect act of caring. To do this, Hope would have to risk everything she had built, including her own image as a stabilizing force, because desire cannot be commanded or managed, it must be invited, and invitation requires vulnerability. Against Sonia's instinct to shield her and Fred's fear of losing her again, Hope chose to make herself visible in a new way, not as a guardian or guide but as a participant, someone willing to admit uncertainty and doubt publicly, and when she spoke to the world she did not offer solutions or reassurance, she told the truth of her own fear, her own exhaustion, her own moments of wanting to step back and let things fall apart, and this confession, broadcast and shared far beyond its initial audience, landed with a force no ritual ever had, because it pierced the illusion that strength meant invulnerability, and in seeing Hope struggle, people recognized their own struggle as legitimate rather than shameful. The enemy reacted immediately, flooding discourse with distortions, reframing her honesty as weakness, her openness as manipulation, and while some accepted these narratives eagerly, others felt something stir, a flicker of recognition that they had been waiting not for perfection but for permission to care imperfectly, and this spark ignited in unexpected places, small acts of re-engagement rippling outward, people returning to abandoned responsibilities not with renewed optimism but with quiet resolve, and though the drift did not reverse overnight, its momentum slowed. Sensing its influence waning, the opposing force revealed itself more clearly than ever before, not as a singular entity but as a convergence of impulses giving coherence, manifesting through systems and ideologies that promise liberation from effort, and hope confronted it directly in a space beyond physical geography, a threshold formed by collective intention where meaning itself was contested, and there, stripped of intermediaries and symbols, the enemy spoke plainly, arguing not that it was evil but that it was merciful, that humanity had proven again and again that the weight of freedom crushed more people than it saved, and that surrender was not annihilation but relief. Hope listened without interruption, because she understood now that dismissal only strengthened such arguments, and when she responded she did not deny humanity's suffering or minimize its failures, she acknowledged them fully, then asked a question so simple it unsettled the space itself. What made suffering unbearable was not choice, but isolation, and what the enemy offered was not relief but separation, the severing of individuals from one another under the guise of peace. She spoke of her parents, of Marcus, of countless unnamed people who had endured not because they were strong alone but because they had been seen, held accountable, forgiven, challenged, and loved, and she argued that responsibility without connection became cruelty, but connection without responsibility became emptiness, and that balance, true balance, lived in the tension between the two. The confrontation did not end with victory or defeat, because forces like this do not vanish when contradicted, but something fundamental shifted, a recalibration of the field itself, as if the rules governing influence had been rewritten, limiting the enemy's reach wherever people remained in relationship, and hope returned from that threshold changed, drained but grounded, aware that the future would not hinge on grand confrontations but on countless small choices made in community. In the months that followed, the world did not heal cleanly, but it stabilized, oscillating between engagement and withdrawal, progress and regression, and hope accepted this unevenness as the natural state of things, resisting the urge to impose order where growth required time. Sonia watched her daughter with a mixture of awe and worry, recognizing that hope was no longer moving towards some final destiny but settling into a lifelong role, one that would demand renewal rather than sacrifice, and together they began planning not for victory but for sustainability, for how this work would continue even if hope one day stepped back, because the ultimate measure of success would not be how essential she remained, but how unnecessary she could eventually become. As seasons turned and the immediate crisis receded into a persistent background tension, Hope allowed herself moments of ordinary life again, walking through markets, sharing meals, laughing without listening for distant currents, and in these moments she rediscovered something she had nearly lost, joy unburdened by purpose, and she understood then that this too was resistance, because joy affirmed that life was worth the effort of choosing. And so the story did not move toward an ending but toward equilibrium, fragile and dynamic, held not by contracts or guardians alone but by a growing collective willingness to stay present, to choose engagement over ease, again and again, knowing there would be days they failed and days they succeeded, and that meaning lived not in perfection but in persistence, as hope stood at the edge of another dawn, feeling the quiet hum of a world still learning how to carry itself, and chose, without ceremony or certainty, to keep walking forward with it. She returned home for the longer stretch she had allowed herself in years, settling into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply comforting, mornings spent walking the same paths she had walked as a child, afternoons helping Sonia organize archives of testimonies and records that traced the long shadow of the contract era, and evenings sitting with Fred on the porch, where silence no longer felt like something to be feared but something earned. Yet beneath this calm, current still moved, subtle and restless, because the force they had confronted had not vanished, it had adapted, fragmenting into quieter forms, embedding itself in habits rather than crises, and Hope sensed it most strongly not in places of despair but in places of comfort, where people, relieved that catastrophe had been postponed, began once again to drift toward convenience over conscience. The world's leaders held conferences and issued statements declaring a new age of responsibility, but Hope paid closer attention to smaller indicators, to whether neighbors spoke to one another again, whether parents apologized to their children, whether institutions revised not just policies but priorities, and what she saw was mixed, a patchwork of sincere effort and performative change, progress advancing in some places while stalling in others. Sonia warned her gently not to carry the weight of global outcomes on her shoulders alone, reminding her that even symbols needed rest, and Hope tried to listen, but rest proved elusive, because even in stillness her awareness remained tuned outward, always listening for imbalance. It was during one such quiet evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, that Hope received a message unlike any she had encountered before, not a threat or plea, but an invitation, transmitted through the same subtle channels Marcus had once used, now stripped of menace and layered instead with something like curiosity. The sender identified themselves only as the witness, claiming no allegiance to the old contract system nor to its opposing force, and requesting a meeting not to bargain or warn, but to understand. Against her parents' instincts, Hope agreed, recognizing that the next stage of their work could not be purely defensive, that understanding neutral forces might be as crucial as confronting hostile ones. They met in an unremarkable place, a public library nearly forgotten by the digital age, where the smell of old paper grounded the conversation in something human and finite. The witness appeared ordinary, almost deliberately so, a middle-aged figure with tired eyes and hands marked by work, and they spoke not of power or destiny but of observation, explaining that throughout history there had always been those who watched rather than acted, chroniclers of moral turning points who believed intervention distorted outcomes, yet recent events had shaken this belief. The witness described how the breaking of Marcus's contract had created ripples not just in human systems but in the deeper architecture governing choice itself, revealing that intervention rooted in accountability rather than caution could alter trajectories without erasing agency, and this discovery unsettled long-held assumptions about neutrality. They asked Hope whether choosing not to act was itself a choice with consequences, and whether observers bore responsibility equal to participants, and Hope answered honestly that she did not know, that certainty was often the enemy of growth, but that she believed refusing responsibility did not free one from impact, it merely obscured it. The conversation stretched for hours, branching into philosophy, history, and personal reflection, and when they parted, the witness did not pledge allegiance or offer aid, only promised to reconsider their stance, and Hope sensed that even this shift, small and internal, mattered. As weeks passed, new patterns emerged, subtle yet unmistakable, as individuals who had once stood apart began stepping cautiously into engagement, not with grand gestures but with questions, audits, and local initiatives that emphasized transparency over authority. These developments lacked the drama of past confrontations, and so they went largely unnoticed by media and mythmakers, but Hope recognized them as signs of a deeper transformation, one that could endure precisely because it was unremarkable. At the same time, resistance surfaced in new forms, not overt opposition but nostalgia, a longing for simpler narratives of good and evil, saviors and villains, and Hope struggled with this most of all, because she understood the comfort such stories provided, even as they limited growth. Fred, sensing her internal conflict, shared something he had never spoken aloud before, admitting that part of him missed the clarity of his own downfall, the moment when his failure had been named and confronted, because redemption afterward, while harder, had been structured, whereas living rightly day after day offered no such structure, only ongoing vigilance. This admission resonated deeply with Hope, illuminating a truth she had skirted around, that many people resisted responsibility not because it was painful, but because it was endless, and the idea of never being finished exhausted them. Together, they discussed how systems might be designed not to eliminate effort but to support it sustainably, allowing rest without erasure, accountability without despair. These reflections informed the next evolution of Sonia's foundation, which began focusing less on crisis intervention and more on maintenance, on teaching communities how to build rituals of renewal rather than cycles of sacrifice. Instead of waiting for failure to demand confession, they encouraged regular reflection, collective check-ins where responsibility was shared and adjusted before resentment could calcify. Hope participated in these gatherings quietly, often without revealing her identity, listening more than speaking, learning how people negotiated responsibility in everyday life, how they balanced care for others with care for themselves. She found inspiration not in the most eloquent speakers but in those who admitted confusion, who asked for help without drama, who corrected course without collapsing into shame. Yet even as this grassroots effort flourished, a new tension brewed on the horizon, one that Hope felt before she could name it, a tightening in the conceptual space where choice and consequence met. Reports emerged of regions where people were experiencing what they described as echo decisions, choices that seemed made for them by patterns they did not consciously endorse, habits inherited rather than chosen, and while psychologists framed this as behavioral inertia, Hope sensed something deeper, an emergent phenomenon born from the long struggle between responsibility and relief. She realized with a start that the enemy they had faced had not been destroyed but dispersed, its core argument diluted yet persistent, now manifesting as systemic momentum rather than ideological pressure. This realization led Hope to a difficult insight, that the next challenge would not be a battle against an external force, but against complacency encoded into structures themselves, and confronting this would require patience on a scale even she found daunting. She convened a small council not of leaders but of practitioners, educators, caregivers, and designers, people who shaped environments more than policies, and together they explored how physical and social spaces could either reinforce passive drift or invite mindful participation. They studied cities where public spaces encouraged lingering and dialogue rather than transit, workplaces that rewarded ethical pauses rather than constant output, schools that framed mistakes as data rather than defects, and slowly, incrementally, these ideas spread. The change was uneven and often reversible, and there were moments when Hope felt the familiar pull toward decisive intervention, the urge to accelerate progress through force of will. But each time she felt this, she remembered Marcus's final act, the choice to accept consequence rather than evade it, and she understood that imposing transformation would betray the very principles they sought to protect. Instead, she learned to tolerate frustration, to trust processes she could not control, and this restraint became her greatest discipline. Years passed, marked not by climaxes but by accumulation, and Hope matured into a role that defied easy description, neither guardian nor ruler, but something closer to a steward of attention, guiding focus toward what mattered without dictating outcomes. Sonia aged gracefully, her strength shifting from endurance to wisdom, and Fred found peace in ordinary acts of care, mentoring others who faced the aftermath of moral failure, teaching them that confession was not an ending but a beginning. Occasionally, traces of Marcus surfaced, not in messages but in rumors, stories of a man seen aiding refugees, dismantling exploitative systems, always moving on before gratitude could find him, and Hope held these stories close, not as proof of redemption completed, but as evidence that choice could echo forward even in exile. Eventually, Hope sensed another threshold approaching, not a confrontation but a handoff, a moment when her presence would need to recede to allow others to step fully into agency, and this prospect filled her with a bittersweet mixture of relief and grief. She began preparing quietly, documenting lessons learned not as commandments but as questions, training facilitators rather than successors, emphasizing that the work was not to preserve her legacy but to remain adaptable. On her final public address of this era, she spoke briefly, not of threats or hope in the abstract, but of gratitude, thanking people for choosing to remain engaged even when it was inconvenient, for accepting that the work of being human was never complete, and for understanding that light was not a state achieved but a direction chosen. When she stepped back, the world did not falter, it wobbled, adjusted, and continued, imperfectly but independently, and Hope found herself finally free to live more fully within the life she had protected, forming relationships unburdened by symbolism, discovering interests unrelated to destiny, and embracing the humility of being one participant among many. She remained attentive, always, but no longer central, and in this decentralization she found the deepest affirmation of all, that the balance they had fought for did not depend on a single figure, but on a collective willingness to choose awareness over avoidance, connection over isolation, again and again, across generations. And so the story moved forward, not toward a final resolution but into a living continuum, where every choice, however small, carried weight, where responsibility was shared rather than imposed, and where hope, no longer a singular name or symbol, became a practice woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life, enduring not because it was guaranteed, but because people kept choosing it, imperfectly, persistently, together. Hope sensed it first in herself, waking some mornings with the weight of attentiveness pressing heavier than before, the old instinct to scan the moral horizon dulled by the sheer constancy of responsibility. She did not resent the work, but she felt the cost of it, and she understood then that what they were facing was not a resurgence of darkness, but the slow dimming of light through neglect. Communities that had once held regular cycles of reflection began postponing them. Just this once, organizer said. We are stable now. Institutions that had redesigned systems to encourage ethical pauses quietly reintroduced productivity benchmarks, not maliciously, but pragmatically, telling themselves that values could be reinserted later. Hope watched this with a calm that surprised even her, because she had learned by now that panic accelerated decay, while patience could sometimes reverse it. Still, she knew patience alone would not be enough. The challenge was no longer to confront a villain or dismantle a curse, but to remind people why they had chosen awareness in the first place, without frightening them, without shaming them, and without positioning herself once again as a central axis. It was during this time that Hope began traveling anonymously, moving through towns and cities not as a symbol but as a listener, attending community meetings, classrooms, factory floors, and homes, absorbing the small stories people told when they believed no one important was listening. She heard the same refrain repeated in countless variations: we meant to do better, but life got in the way. Not cruelty. Not indifference. Just drift. And in that drift, she recognized the final, most insidious legacy of the old contract system, the belief that responsibility was something dramatic, activated only in moments of crisis, rather than something lived continuously, quietly, and without reward. In one town, she sat with a group of teachers who admitted they had stopped revisiting their ethical frameworks because students seemed a fine. In another, she listened to a council that had quietly deferred transparency measures because no one was demanding them anymore. Each time, Hope resisted the urge to instruct. Instead, she asked questions. What had changed since the last time you felt proud of your work? What had you stopped doing, not because it failed, but because it required effort? These questions unsettled people more than accusations ever could, because they forced reflection rather than defense. Slowly, conversations shifted. Not dramatically, but meaningfully. Meanwhile, something else stirred beneath the surface of the world, something that did not announce itself through fear or temptation, but through numbness. Analysts began noticing anomalies in decision-making patterns, entire populations making choices that statistically aligned with least resistance rather than preference, as though collectively we were being flattened into habit. The language used to describe this phenomenon was clinical, detached, but Hope recognized its shape immediately. This was not a force imposing itself. It was absence gaining momentum. The space where choice should have been, left unattended long enough to calcify. Hope returned home after months on the road and spoke at length with Sonia, who listened with the same steady presence that had anchored her for decades. Sonia did not offer solutions. She offered perspective. You're seeing what happens when people mistake survival for living, she said quietly. They think because they avoided catastrophe, they finished the work. Sonia reminded Hope of something she herself had once struggled to accept, that no generation completes the task it inherits. It only carries it forward in altered form. And that realization, instead of discouraging Hope, grounded her. The work was not failing. It was evolving. Inspired by this, Hope initiated what would later be called the Continuum Project, though at the time it had no name and no centralized structure. It was not a movement or organization, but a framework, open source in spirit and execution, designed to embed reflection into the ordinary flow of life rather than isolate it in special moments. Instead of scheduled rituals, it encouraged micro-practices, brief pauses before decisions, shared language for naming uncertainty, cultural permission to revise choices without humiliation. The idea was simple but radical: make responsibility lightweight enough to carry daily, rather than so heavy it was only lifted in emergencies. The project spread not because Hope promoted it, but because people adapted it, reshaped it, claimed it as their own. In some places, it took the form of redesigned workdays with built-in review moments. In others, it became a family practice, a few minutes each evening spent asking not, "What did we achieve?" but, "Where did we act with intention today?" These practices did not eliminate failure. They normalized it. And in doing so, they weakened the old narrative that mistakes required sacrifice rather than correction. Still, there were setbacks. Entire regions abandoned the framework when economic pressure mounted. Some leaders dismissed it as inefficient. Others tried to weaponize it, turning reflection into surveillance, accountability into control. Each misuse carried echoes of the past, and each time, Hope felt the familiar tension between intervention and restraint. She chose restraint more often than not, trusting that systems built on coercion would collapse under their own weight, while those built on consent would endure more quietly. One evening, long after Hope had stepped fully out of public visibility, she received a message she had not expected to see again. It bore no sender name, only a familiar cadence, a tone she recognized instantly. Marcus. The message was brief, unadorned, and written without apology or drama. He did not say where he was or what he had endured. He said only that he had seen the Continuum Project taking root in places he passed through, that he recognized its design, and that for the first time since his binding was broken, he felt he was no longer running from his past, but moving alongside it. "Whatever I become," he wrote, "it will be honest." Hope read the message once and did not reply. She did not need to. Some stories, she had learned, were not meant to be continued through dialogue, but through parallel movement, separate paths aligned by shared intention. She closed the message and returned to her work, to the quiet practice of attention that had become her true calling. Years flowed onward, marked by neither triumph nor collapse, but by a growing resilience that did not depend on heroes. Children who grew up within the Continuum framework spoke a different moral language, less rigid, less dramatic, more forgiving, and more demanding in subtle ways. They asked not who was to blame, but what needed tending. They understood that light did not eliminate shadow, it coexisted with it, requiring constant adjustment rather than final victory. Hope aged into this world gently. Her role diminished until it was indistinguishable from participation. She taught when asked, listened when needed, and stepped aside when others stepped forward. There were moments of grief, of course, when old patterns resurfaced, when suffering fled where it should not have, and she never told herself that the work was complete. But she no longer felt the burden of completion. She understood at last that continuity, not closure, was the true measure of success. And so the story continued, not in chapters marked by catastrophe, but in countless ordinary moments where someone paused instead of proceeding, questioned instead of complying, confessed instead of concealing, and chose, again and again, the harder, quieter path. No contracts were signed. No lives were traded. No singular savior emerged. Only people, imperfect and aware, carrying forward the fragile, powerful practice of choosing with open eyes. And somewhere within that ongoing choosing, the legacy of a broken curse transformed into something far more enduring, not a warning etched in fear, but a living reminder that freedom was not the absence of consequence, but the willingness to face it together, day after day, without needing darkness to force the lesson.